I'm Tessa, 32 years old, and I thought I'd seen the worst of my ex-mother-in-law's cruelty. I was wrong. When Margaret opened her front door that Saturday afternoon, her smile died the moment she saw me standing there. "Oh," she said, like finding a spider in her teacup. "You're early. Where are you watching from today?" Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely powerless watching someone hurt your child. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. I wasn't early. I was exactly on time to pick up my 7-year-old daughter Piper from Margaret's little birthday celebration. But before I could say anything, I heard feet running across hardwood floors. "Mommy!" Piper's voice cracked with tears as she appeared behind Margaret, clutching her pink backpack like a lifeline. My breath caught in my throat. My beautiful daughter's natural curls were gone, replaced by pin-straight hair that hung limply around her shoulders. Worse, they'd chopped it into an uneven bob that looked like someone had put a bowl on her head and cut around it. "What did you do?" The words came out strangled. Piper launched herself at me, wrapping her arms around my waist and burying her face against my stomach. I could feel her little body shaking. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, that. It was just a little makeover. She looked so wild before. I took her to my salon this morning so she'd be presentable for my party." Presentable. The word hit me like a slap. My daughter had the most gorgeous spiral curls that I'd spent years teaching her to love and care for. We had our special Sunday routine with leave-in conditioner and detangling spray. I'd bought her silk pillowcases and taught her to pineapple her hair at night. We read books about girls who looked like her, watched movies with natural hair representation, and practiced affirmations about being beautiful exactly as she was. "You had no right," I said, my voice deadly calm even as rage built in my chest. "No right at all. It's just hair, Tessa." Margaret's tone suggested I was being dramatic. "It'll grow back. Besides, it was getting so unmanageable. The poor thing couldn't even brush it properly." That was a lie. Piper knew exactly how to care for her hair, but Margaret had always made comments. Always. Little digs about Piper needing better hair products, or how difficult textured hair must be to maintain. I'd watched my daughter's confidence chip away with every visit. "The lady used a lot of hot stuff on it." "Mommy," Piper whispered against my shirt. "It smelled bad and my head got really hot. I told her I wanted my curls back, but she said they weren't pretty." My heart shattered. I knelt down to Piper's level, cupping her sweet face in my hands. "Baby, your natural hair is absolutely beautiful. This doesn't change that." "Okay, hair grows and we're going to take such good care of it while it does." Margaret rolled her eyes. "Really, you're making such a fuss over nothing. It was just a little trim and blowout. She looks much neater now." I stood slowly, keeping one hand on Piper's shoulder. "We're leaving. Now." "But the party just started." "I have cake, and—" "No." I picked up Piper, who wrapped her legs around my waist and buried her face in my neck. "We're done here." As I walked back to my car, Margaret called after us. "You're overreacting, Tessa. It was just a bit of fun. Don't be so sensitive." I buckled Piper into her car seat, kissed her forehead, and got behind the wheel with hands that shook with fury. I'd dealt with Margaret's microaggressions for years, but this crossed every line. This was an assault on my child's sense of self, her cultural identity, her autonomy over her own body. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd hoped I'd never have to use. Sarah Davidson was a family law attorney I'd met at a hospital fundraiser last year. We'd talked about custody issues, and she'd given me her card saying to call if I ever needed legal advice. The phone rang twice before a crisp voice answered. "Davidson Law Firm, this is attorney Sarah Davidson." "Sarah, it's Tessa Williams from Children's Hospital. We met at the charity auction. I need to talk to you about my ex-mother-in-law. She cut off my daughter's hair without permission." "What happened?" Her tone immediately shifted to concern. I glanced back at Piper, who was staring out the window with tears still streaming down her cheeks. She had my daughter's natural curls chemically straightened and chopped off because she decided Piper didn't look presentable enough for her birthday party. The silence on the other end told me Sarah understood this wasn't just about hair. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs earlier. But when you're in love and planning a wedding, you tend to make excuses for the people who matter to your future husband, even when those people make it crystal clear they think you're not good enough for their precious son. I met David Williams 6 years ago at a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, where I worked as a pediatric nurse. He was there representing his marketing firm, and I was volunteering at the registration table. He had this warm smile and genuine laugh that drew me in immediately. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours, covering everything from our shared love of hiking to our dreams of traveling the world. David was everything I thought I wanted. Successful, thoughtful, educated, and kind. He brought me flowers just because, remembered little things I mentioned, and made me feel like the most important person in the room. He was also white, which shouldn't have mattered but absolutely did to his mother. The first time David brought me home to meet his parents, Margaret greeted me with a smile so fake I could practically see the effort it took to maintain it. She looked me up and down like she was appraising livestock, taking in my natural hair pulled back in a professional bun, my conservative dress, my nervous smile. "So, you're a nurse?" she said, making it sound like I'd admitted to being a professional dog walker. How practical. His father, Robert, was warmer but clearly following Margaret's lead. They asked polite questions about my work, my family, my education, but I could feel the judgment radiating from Margaret with every answer. When I mentioned that my parents owned a small accounting firm, she smiled that cold smile again. "Oh, how nice. David, didn't you say she worked at the hospital? I wasn't sure if you meant as a nurse or in administration." David jumped in quickly. "Mom, I told you Tessa's a pediatric nurse. She's incredible at what she does. The kids absolutely love her." "Of course they do," Margaret said, but her tone suggested this wasn't necessarily a compliment. The evening continued with subtle digs wrapped in polite conversation. Comments about how interesting my hair was, how exotic I looked, how different our backgrounds were. She asked invasive questions about my family's finances, my student loans, whether I planned to keep working after marriage. David seemed oblivious to the undercurrents. He was genuinely proud of me, showing off pictures on his phone of a charity event we'd organized together, bragging about my work with sick children. But every time he praised me, I watched Margaret's expression grow a little more pinched. After dinner, while David was in the bathroom, Margaret cornered me in the kitchen. "You seem like a nice enough girl," she said, loading the dishwasher with unnecessary force. "But I hope you understand that David comes from a certain kind of family. We have expectations." I kept my voice level. "What kind of expectations? The country club, charity galas, business dinners? David's career depends on having the right kind of wife beside him, someone who fits in with his social circle." The message was crystal clear. I wasn't the right kind of wife. I was too black, too working class, too different from their suburban white expectations. "I think David can decide what kind of wife is right for him," I said calmly. Margaret's smile turned arctic. "Of course, dear. I'm just saying, marriage is about more than just feelings. It's about compatibility. Shared values, similar backgrounds." When David came back, Margaret was all warmth and charm again, asking if I needed anything, complimenting my dress. But the damage was done. I knew exactly where I stood with my future mother-in-law. The worst part? David genuinely didn't see it. When I tried to talk to him about his mother's behavior during the drive home, he dismissed my concerns. "She's just protective," he said. "She'll warm up once she gets to know you better." She was the same way with my college girlfriend. But his college girlfriend was a blonde named Ashley who came from old money and worked in Daddy's real estate firm. Somehow, I doubted Margaret had questioned Ashley's fitness to join the family. Over the next year, as David and I got more serious, Margaret's hostility became more creative. She'd plan family events without telling me, then act surprised when David showed up alone. She'd make comments about how urban my neighborhood was when she visited. She bought me books about proper etiquette and entertaining with class for Christmas. The breaking point came when David proposed. He did it beautifully, at the Botanical Gardens, where we'd had our first official date. I was over the moon, calling my family, sharing the news with friends. But when David called his parents, Margaret's reaction was telling. "Well," she said after a long pause, "I suppose congratulations are in order." Not exactly the enthusiastic response you hope for from your future mother-in-law. Wedding planning with Margaret was like walking through a minefield blindfolded. Every decision became a battle. Every choice I made was somehow wrong, and David consistently took his mother's side while insisting he was keeping the peace. Have you ever experienced someone who smiles at you while slowly poisoning every conversation? Drop a comment below if you've dealt with a master manipulator. You'll understand what came next. Margaret started by suggesting we hire her wedding planner, a woman named Vivian who had such refined taste and understood what families like theirs expected. When I met Vivian, she took one look at me and started talking about toning down my ideas and choosing more classic options. I wanted to incorporate some elements that honored my heritage. Nothing dramatic, just small touches like including some traditional foods at the reception or having my cousin Marcus play saxophone during the ceremony. But every suggestion was met with concern about whether it would be appropriate for the venue or comfortable for the other guests. "Maybe we could do something more universal," Vivian suggested with a patronizing smile. We want all your guests to feel included. The irony wasn't lost on me. My ideas were too specific to my culture, but apparently catering exclusively to Margaret's preferences was perfectly universal. The dress shopping was its own nightmare. Margaret insisted on coming along and brought her sister Helen, who had opinions about everything. They steered me toward dresses that were, in their words, sophisticated and timeless. Translation: boring and conservative. When I tried on a dress with some beading and a slightly more fitted silhouette that I actually loved, Helen wrinkled her nose. It's very sparkly. Don't you think something simpler would be more elegant? Margaret nodded enthusiastically. Helen's right. You don't want to look too flashy. David's colleagues will be at the wedding. I ended up choosing a dress that was beautiful but felt like armor. Safe, conservative, designed to help me blend into their world rather than celebrate who I was. The guest list battles were even worse. Margaret had strong opinions about the caliber of venue we should choose, and worried that some of my family members might not fit the atmosphere. She actually suggested we have two separate celebrations, a small, intimate ceremony for close family and a larger casual party later for everyone else. It's not about exclusion, she insisted when I pushed back. It's about creating the right tone for David's career. These connections matter. David, bless his heart, couldn't see how insulting this was. She's just trying to help, he kept saying. Wedding planning is stressful. Maybe having two events isn't such a bad idea. But I knew what she was really saying. My family, my friends, my community weren't good enough for their country club venue. The final straw came during the rehearsal dinner. Margaret had insisted on hosting it at the country club, despite my suggestion that we do something more casual where everyone would feel comfortable. She'd also taken over the guest list for this event, limiting it to immediate family and close friends, a designation that somehow included David's entire extended family and college buddies, but excluded several people who were important to me. During her speech at the dinner, Margaret talked about how thrilled she was to welcome me into the family and how she knew I would adapt beautifully to their way of life. The word adapt hit me like a slap. Not integrate, not contribute, but adapt. Like I was the one who needed to change to fit their mold. But the real moment of clarity came later that evening. I overheard Margaret talking to Helen in the ladies' room, not realizing I was in one of the stalls. She's actually quite lovely when she tries, Margaret was saying. And David is so smitten. I just hope the children don't end up too, Too what? Helen asked. Well, confused about their identity. It's hard enough for mixed children as it is. My future children hadn't even been conceived yet, and Margaret was already worried about their blackness contaminating the family gene pool. I sat in that bathroom stall, listening to my future mother-in-law discuss my hypothetical children like they were a problem to be managed, and I should have called off the wedding right then. Should have walked out of that country club and never looked back. Instead, I told myself it would get better after the wedding, that once we were married and I'd proven myself, Margaret would accept me. I convinced myself that David's love would eventually shield me from his mother's prejudice. I was so incredibly naive. The wedding itself was beautiful in the way that perfectly orchestrated events always are. Everything looked magazine perfect, from the flower arrangements to the lighting to my dress, that photographed beautifully even if it didn't feel like me. Margaret beamed all day, playing the role of the gracious mother-in-law for the cameras, but I noticed things. The way she steered certain relatives away from my family during cocktail hour. The way she introduced me to David's colleagues as David's wife, rather than using my name. The way she managed to position herself in most of the important family photos while somehow excluding my parents from several group shots. During our first dance, David whispered, "See, I told you everything would work out. Mom's so happy." I smiled and nodded, but I was watching Margaret over his shoulder. She was watching us too, and her expression wasn't happy. It was calculating, like she was already planning her next move. Our honeymoon was blissful, a 2-week escape to Italy, where none of David's family could interfere. But the morning we got back, there were 3 voicemails from Margaret on our answering machine, each one more urgent than the last, about helping us settle into married life properly. Marriage to David might have been tolerable if Margaret had stayed in her lane, but within months of our wedding, she made it clear that she considered our relationship her project to manage, and me her problem to solve. It started with the Sunday dinners. "It's just tradition," David explained when Margaret began expecting us every single week. She's always done Sunday dinner with family. But these weren't casual family meals. They were 3-hour productions where Margaret held court, discussing David's career prospects, neighborhood gossip, and her various charity work. I was expected to listen, nod, and occasionally contribute appropriately timed compliments about her cooking or her decorating choices. Margaret had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment. "Tessa, that's an interesting choice of lipstick. So bold." Or, "I love how confident you are about your hair. I could never be so adventurous." Each comment delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. She'd bring up topics designed to highlight our differences. "David, remember when you dated that lovely Ashley Morrison? Her mother was just elected president of the Junior League. Such accomplished women in that family." When I got a promotion to charge nurse in the pediatric ICU, Margaret's response was telling. "How wonderful, dear. All those extra responsibilities. I hope it won't interfere with your home life once you start having babies." David's response to his mother's behavior was consistently disappointing. When I'd try to discuss her comments with him, he'd minimize everything. "That's just how she talks," he'd say. "She doesn't mean anything by it." But Margaret absolutely meant something by it. Every interaction was calculated to remind me that I was an outsider trying to break into their perfect white suburban world. The real escalation began when David and I started trying to have a baby. Margaret suddenly became very interested in genetics and family history. She'd bring up David's baby pictures constantly, talking about his beautiful features and how she hoped his children would take after him. "You know," she said during one particularly uncomfortable dinner, "the Williams men have such strong genes. David looks just like his father and grandfather. I'm sure any children he has will favor his side of the family." The subtext was clear. She was hoping my blackness would be somehow diluted or erased in my children. When I finally got pregnant with Piper, Margaret's reaction was complex. She was excited about becoming a grandmother, but her excitement came with conditions and concerns. She immediately began planning how she would be involved, what kind of nursery we should have, what names would be appropriate. "I hope you'll consider family names," she said, producing a handwritten list of Williams family names going back generations. All of them were aggressively white and traditional. It's so important for children to understand their heritage. I looked at that list: Margaret, Elizabeth, Catherine, Robert, William, Charles, and felt my unborn daughter's identity being erased before she was even born. "What about names from my family?" I asked. Margaret's smile faltered slightly. "Well, of course you'll want to honor your side too. Maybe as middle names?" David, as usual, tried to broker a compromise. "We'll figure out something that works for everyone," he said. But I was tired of compromises that always seemed to favor Margaret's preferences over mine. The pregnancy brought out Margaret's most controlling tendencies. She had opinions about everything from my prenatal care to my birthing plan. She questioned my choice to work until close to my due date, worried about the stress I was putting on the baby. "When I was pregnant with David, I took such good care of myself," she'd say. "I stopped working completely and focused entirely on creating the perfect environment for my baby." She bought baby clothes exclusively in neutral colors, explaining that she wanted to wait and see what the baby looked like before choosing more specific styles. When I registered for baby items that included books and toys featuring diverse characters, Margaret suggested I might be overthinking the representation issue. "Babies don't see color," she said with that fake smile. "They just need love." But I knew my baby would see color, because the world would see her color and treat her accordingly. And I wanted her to grow up proud of all parts of her heritage, not just the parts that made Margaret comfortable. The delivery was beautiful and terrifying and perfect. When Piper emerged with her gorgeous brown skin and a head full of dark curls, I fell in love instantly. She was absolutely perfect, a beautiful blend of David and me. Margaret's first comment when she met her granddaughter was, "Oh, she's so dark. I thought she might be lighter." David immediately jumped to damage control mode. "Mom, she's beautiful. Look at those eyes." But Margaret was still studying Piper like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "I suppose the hair might lighten as she gets older. David was very blonde as a baby." Even in my exhausted, hormonal state, I recognized the disappointment in her voice. My beautiful daughter, less than 6 hours old, was already not meeting Margaret's expectations. That should have been my wake-up call. That should have been the moment I put my foot down and established firm boundaries about how Margaret could interact with my child. Instead, I told myself that once she got to know Piper, Margaret would fall in love with her just like everyone else did. I was still so hopeful that love would eventually conquer Margaret's prejudice. Motherhood changed everything for me, but it didn't change Margaret. If anything, having a granddaughter seemed to intensify her need to control and correct what she saw as problems with Piper's appearance and identity. From the moment we brought Piper home, Margaret had opinions about everything. She questioned my decision to breastfeed, suggesting that formula might be easier to regulate. She worried about Piper's sleep schedule, her growth curve, her developmental milestones. But most of her concerns centered around Piper's appearance. "Have you thought about products for her hair?" Margaret asked when Piper was barely 3 months old. "It's getting so thick. I saw some smoothing creams at the drugstore that might help." I held my baby closer. "Her hair is perfect exactly as it is." "Of course it is, dear. I just meant for manageability. You know how difficult textured hair can be." Margaret had never in her life dealt with textured hair, but suddenly she was an expert on its difficulties. As Piper grew into a toddler, Margaret's comments became more frequent and more pointed. She'd suggest hairstyles that required pulling Piper's curls back tightly. She bought hair accessories that were designed for straight hair and then expressed frustration when they didn't work properly on Piper's texture. "Maybe we could find someone who specializes in this type of hair," she suggested when Piper was 2. "Someone who could teach her how to manage it properly." "I know how to manage my daughter's hair," I said firmly, "and I'm teaching her to care for it herself." But Margaret persisted. Every family gathering included comments about Piper's hair being wild or unruly. She'd try to smooth it down with her hands, making disapproving sounds when the curls bounced back into place. The worst part was watching how these comments affected Piper as she got older. My confident, joyful daughter began touching her hair self-consciously during Margaret's visits. She started asking me why Grandma didn't like her curls. "Grandma loves you very much," I'd tell her. "She just doesn't understand how beautiful natural hair is." But how do you explain racism to a 4-year-old? How do you tell your child that her grandmother sees her blackness as something to be fixed rather than celebrated? David remained frustratingly oblivious to the damage his mother was doing. When I tried to address Margaret's behavior, he'd minimize it or suggest I was being oversensitive. "She's just trying to help," he'd say. "Hair care isn't her area of expertise." "Then she should keep her opinions to herself," I'd reply. "She's Piper's grandmother. Of course she wants to help with grooming and stuff." But it wasn't help. It was criticism disguised as concern, designed to make both Piper and me feel inadequate. The situation escalated when Piper started kindergarten. Margaret began asking invasive questions about how Piper was fitting in with her classmates, whether she was making friends, how the other parents treated her. "Is she having any difficulties?" Margaret would ask with exaggerated concern. "Sometimes children who look different have a harder time socially." She'd volunteer to pick Piper up from school occasionally, and I'd worry the entire time about what she might say to my daughter or her teachers. Margaret had a way of planting seeds of doubt and insecurity that could take weeks to undo. The breaking point came during Piper's 6th birthday party. I'd planned a wonderful celebration in our backyard with her friends from school and our neighborhood. Piper was radiant in a bright yellow dress, her hair styled in beautiful twist-out that she'd helped me create. Margaret arrived with a gift, a children's book about a little girl who gets a makeover. Not just any makeover, but specifically a hair makeover that transforms the protagonist from messy to beautiful. As Piper opened the gift, Margaret smiled that cold smile. I thought she might enjoy this story. It's about learning to present yourself properly. I watched my daughter flip through pages, showing a girl with curly hair being transformed with straighteners and chemicals into a more acceptable version of herself. The message was crystal clear. Your natural state isn't good enough. That's an interesting choice, I said carefully, taking the book. We have lots of books about loving yourself exactly as you are. Of course, dear, but it's also important to teach children about grooming and self-care. That night, after all the guests had gone home, I found David in the kitchen cleaning up. We need to talk about your mother. He sighed like he was already tired of the conversation. What did she do now? It's not just what she did today, it's the pattern, the constant criticism of Piper's appearance, the suggestions that she needs to be fixed somehow. It's affecting our daughter? David leaned against the counter, crossing his arms defensively. Mom loves Piper. Maybe she's not perfect at expressing it, but her heart is in the right place. Her heart is not in the right place, David. She's teaching our daughter to be ashamed of being black. That's not... Mom isn't racist, Tessa. She's just old-fashioned about some things. Old-fashioned racism is still racism. The argument that followed was explosive. David accused me of being paranoid and oversensitive. I accused him of being willfully blind to his mother's prejudice. We said things that couldn't be taken back, revealed fractures in our relationship that had been widening since Margaret began her campaign against my daughter's self-esteem. Maybe some counseling would help, David suggested finally, for all of us. But I knew Margaret would never agree to counseling, and I was tired of being told that I was the problem when I was simply trying to protect my child from someone who wanted to erase half of who she was. That night, lying in bed next to my husband who couldn't or wouldn't see what his mother was doing to our family, I realized that love wasn't going to be enough to fix this. Marriage counseling lasted 6 months. David's mother never participated. The final year of my marriage was a masterclass in slow-motion destruction. Every family gathering became a battlefield where Margaret fought for Piper's identity, and I fought to preserve it. David remained stubbornly neutral, convinced that if he just ignored the conflict long enough, it would somehow resolve itself. Margaret escalated her tactics after my confrontation with David. She began making plans with Piper that deliberately excluded me, suggesting special grandmother-granddaughter days that always seemed to involve improving something about Piper's appearance. "I thought we might get our nails done," Margaret would suggest during phone calls with Piper, "and maybe visit a salon. Wouldn't that be fun?" When I'd object to these plans, Margaret would act wounded. "I'm just trying to bond with my granddaughter. I want to give her experiences she might not have otherwise." The subtext was always the same. I wasn't providing adequate guidance for feminine presentation, and Margaret needed to step in to correct my deficiencies. David's response to these power struggles was to retreat further into work and pretend nothing was happening. He'd come home to find me stressed and Piper confused about mixed messages regarding her appearance, and he'd just suggest we all needed to communicate better. "Maybe if you gave Mom a chance to explain her perspective," he'd say. "I understand her perspective perfectly," I'd reply. "She thinks our daughter needs to be fixed." The situation reached a crisis point during the Christmas holidays. Margaret had invited us to spend the week at their house, and I'd reluctantly agreed, because David promised he would handle any issues that arose. On Christmas morning, after Piper had opened her gifts, Margaret produced one final present, a gift certificate to an expensive children's salon that specialized in corrective styling for difficult hair types. "I thought this might be useful," Margaret said, pressing the certificate into my hands. "The woman who runs it came highly recommended for children who need professional help with their hair." Piper, who was 7 years old and completely understood the implications, looked between us with tears building in her eyes. "My hair isn't difficult," she said quietly. "Mommy says it's beautiful." Margaret's smile never wavered. "Of course it's beautiful, sweetheart, but sometimes beautiful things need a little professional attention to look their very best." That was the moment I knew my marriage was over. "We're leaving," I announced, standing up from the living room floor where we'd been opening gifts. David immediately went into panic mode. "Tessa, let's just talk about this privately." "No. We've talked about this privately dozens of times, and nothing changes. Your mother just told our 7-year-old daughter that her natural hair is a problem that needs professional correction." Margaret stood too, clutching her pearls like the dramatic martyr she'd always been. "I was trying to help. I spend a fortune on my own hair care, and I wanted to share that knowledge." "Your hair care knowledge doesn't apply to black hair," I said bluntly, "and your constant criticism is teaching my daughter to hate herself." "Don't be ridiculous. I would never want Piper to hate herself." "Then stop telling her she needs to be fixed." The explosion that followed involved raised voices, accusations, and David desperately trying to mediate between his wife and his mother, while understanding neither of our perspectives. Margaret played the victim beautifully, crying about how I was keeping her from her granddaughter and how she'd only ever tried to help. David bought into her performance completely, asking me to apologize for misunderstanding his mother's intentions. I packed our bags and left that afternoon. Piper cried the entire drive home, not because she missed Margaret's manipulations, but because she sensed her family was breaking apart. "Are you and Daddy getting a divorce?" she asked from her car seat. I'd been dreading that question for months. "Daddy and I have some big problems we need to figure out," I said carefully. "But no matter what happens, we both love you very much." The divorce proceedings took 8 months. David genuinely couldn't understand why I was making such a big deal about his mother's behavior. He saw her criticism as clumsy attempts at help, rather than systematic attacks on our daughter's sense of self. "She's not perfect," he admitted during one particularly frustrating counseling session. "But she's family. Can't we find a way to make this work?" But some things can't be compromised on. I couldn't agree to raise my daughter in an environment where her blackness was treated as a problem to be solved. The divorce was finalized 18 months ago. David got alternate weekends and one evening per week with Piper. I got primary custody and the responsibility of rebuilding my daughter's confidence after years of Margaret's subtle psychological warfare. The custody agreement included specific language about major decisions requiring both parents' consent. Haircuts, medical procedures, educational choices, everything had to be discussed and agreed upon. I thought that language would protect Piper from Margaret's interference. I was wrong. 6 months after the divorce, David started asking for additional time with Piper, especially around his mother's birthday. "She really wants to do something special with her granddaughter," he'd say. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Margaret was still Piper's grandmother, and I didn't want to be the vindictive ex-wife who kept a child from her family. That decision would prove to be the biggest mistake of my life. The morning I dropped Piper off at David's apartment for what was supposed to be a simple birthday party for Margaret, my daughter was excited and confident. Her hair was styled in beautiful twist-out that we'd worked on together the night before, and she was wearing her favorite purple dress. "I made Grandma a card," Piper announced proudly, showing me her handmade creation covered in glitter and stickers. "She's going to love it," I assured her, kissing the top of her curly head. 24 hours later, I stood on Margaret's doorstep, looking at my traumatized daughter with butchered hair and tears streaming down her face. And I knew exactly what I had to do next. Sarah Davidson's law office felt like a sanctuary that Monday morning. Piper sat in the corner with coloring books while Sarah and I reviewed the evidence I'd gathered over the weekend. Photos of Piper's hair before and after, text messages from David confirming Margaret had taken her to the salon, and a detailed timeline of Margaret's pattern of behavior. "This is substantial," Sarah said, studying the documentation. "What Margaret did could constitute several civil violations: unauthorized alteration of a minor's appearance, violation of custody agreements, and potentially intentional infliction of emotional distress. What do you think will happen next? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more updates on our journey." I felt a surge of validation hearing a legal professional confirm what I'd known in my heart. This wasn't just about hair. This was about a woman who had systematically undermined my parenting and traumatized my child. "I want to take legal action," I said firmly. "And I want David held accountable for allowing this to happen." Sarah nodded. "We have several options. We can pursue a civil lawsuit for damages, file for modification of the custody agreement to restrict Margaret's access, and potentially file a complaint with Child Protective Services about the violation of parental consent." We spent 2 hours building the case. Sarah explained that the key was establishing a pattern of behavior that showed Margaret's actions were deliberate and racially motivated. My documentation of years of comments about Piper's appearance would be crucial. "The defense will argue it was just a grandmother trying to help," Sarah warned. "They'll say it was a misunderstanding, that she didn't realize you'd object." "She knew exactly what she was doing," I replied. "She's been criticizing Piper's natural hair for years." This was calculated. Sarah's fees were substantial, $350 an hour with a $5,000 retainer. I'd have to use my emergency savings and take on extra shifts, but protecting my daughter was worth any financial sacrifice. By Wednesday, we'd filed a formal complaint with Child Protective Services and initiated custody modification proceedings. The CPS investigation would examine whether Margaret's actions constituted neglect or harm to a minor under her temporary care. Detective Maria Santos, who specialized in family cases, interviewed both Piper and me. Her questions were gentle but thorough. "Can you tell me what happened at the salon?" she asked Piper. My brave daughter, still touching her shortened hair unconsciously, described the experience in heartbreaking detail. How the stylist had used chemicals that made her scalp burn. How Margaret had told the woman to make her presentable. How Piper had asked for her curls back and been ignored. "I told them I wanted to wait for Mommy," Piper said quietly. "But Grandma Margaret said Mommy would be so happy when she saw how pretty I looked." Detective Santos's expression grew harder with each detail. After the interview, she pulled me aside. "This woman knew exactly what she was doing," she said. "The fact that she told your daughter you'd be happy about it shows premeditation. She was preparing Piper to believe this was normal." David's reaction to the legal action was explosive. He called me that evening, his voice shaking with anger. "You're having CPS investigate my mother over a haircut? Are you completely insane?" "It wasn't just a haircut, David. It was unauthorized chemical processing of our daughter's hair. She violated our custody agreement and traumatized Piper. She's 7 years old. Hair grows back. Her self-esteem might not," I said calmly. "And this stops now. You're destroying our family over nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was years of watching Margaret chip away at my daughter's confidence. Years of David refusing to protect us. Years of being told I was overreacting to behavior that was systematically damaging my child. Within a week, David hired his own attorney. The custody battle was about to become very expensive and very public. The local newspaper picked up the story by the following Monday. "Mother seeks custody restrictions after grandmother alters child's hair without permission," the headline read. My phone started ringing immediately. Friends offering support, family members expressing shock, other parents sharing similar stories. The response was largely supportive, but there were also critics who suggested I was overreacting to what they saw as normal grandparent behavior. Margaret's response was predictable. She hired an expensive family law attorney and immediately went on the offensive, painting herself as a victimized grandmother and me as a vindictive ex-daughter-in-law using my child as a weapon. "This is a family matter that's been blown completely out of proportion," her attorney told reporters. Mrs. Williams was simply trying to help her granddaughter look her best for a special occasion. But the community response was overwhelmingly supportive. Other mothers reached out with their own stories of having their children's autonomy violated by well-meaning relatives. The local NAACP chapter issued a statement supporting our case and highlighting the cultural significance of natural black hair. "What this child experienced is part of a larger pattern of discrimination that black children face," their spokesperson said. "Natural hair is not a problem to be fixed." By the end of that first week, I realized this case had become bigger than just our family. It was about every black child who'd been told their natural hair wasn't good enough, every parent who'd fought to build their child's self-esteem against societal pressure to conform. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month. As I prepared to face Margaret and David in court, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years of dealing with her manipulation. I felt like I was finally fighting back. The preliminary hearing drew more attention than I'd expected. The courthouse was busy with regular family court proceedings, but our case had generated enough local interest that several reporters were present. Margaret arrived with her expensive legal team, dressed in a conservative navy suit that screamed respectability. David sat with his mother's legal team, having been advised that our interests were now adverse. He avoided eye contact with me completely, but I could see the stress in his posture. His sister Linda had flown in from Seattle to show family support. I sat with Sarah and my parents, who had driven down from their accounting firm to be there. My father, usually a man of few words, had been surprisingly vocal about his support. "That woman crossed a line," he'd said simply. "Nobody touches our grandbaby without permission." Judge Patricia Morrison called our case, and Margaret's attorney immediately argued for dismissal. "Your Honor, this is clearly a family dispute that should be resolved through mediation, not litigation. My client is a loving grandmother who made an error in judgment about a haircut." The family court prosecutor, working with CPS, disagreed. "Your Honor, this case involves violation of parental consent for a medical procedure, chemical hair processing, performed on a 7-year-old child. The child explicitly requested that they wait for her mother and was ignored." Judge Morrison reviewed the case file, her expression growing more serious as she read. "The matter will proceed. This court takes violations of parental consent regarding minor children very seriously." Margaret's composure cracked slightly at the ruling. Her attorney quickly pivoted to requesting minimal supervised visitation, painting Margaret as a pillar of the community who posed no risk to the child. "Mrs. Williams has been a member of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church for 30 years and volunteers with several local charities," he argued. Sarah countered with evidence of Margaret's pattern of behavior. "Your Honor, we have documentation showing a consistent pattern of the respondent undermining the mother's parenting decisions, specifically targeting the child's racial identity and appearance." Judge Morrison set a trial date for 6 weeks later and ordered that Margaret have only supervised visitation with Piper pending resolution. David's face went white at that ruling. Outside the courthouse, Margaret's attorney held a brief statement. "Mrs. Williams is disappointed by these restrictions," he announced. "She's a loving grandmother who is simply trying to help her granddaughter prepare for a family celebration." A reporter asked about the chemical processing of Piper's hair. The attorney dismissed it as routine salon treatment and suggested I was using my daughter as a weapon in a bitter custody dispute. That evening, my story was featured on the local news. The segment was balanced but clearly sympathetic to our position. They interviewed Dr. Rachel Kim, the child psychologist we'd been working with, who explained the potential psychological impact of Margaret's actions. When adults alter a child's appearance without consent, especially appearance tied to cultural identity, it sends a message that the child's natural state is unacceptable, Dr. Kim explained. The segment also included brief interviews with other parents who'd experienced similar situations, showing that our case wasn't isolated. 3 days later, something unexpected happened. David called and asked to meet in person. We met at a coffee shop near Piper's school. He looked exhausted, older than his 34 years. The confident man I'd married seemed diminished somehow. "I've been seeing a counselor," he said without preamble, "trying to understand what happened to our family." I waited, not sure where this conversation was heading. "My therapist helped me see some things I'd been blind to," he continued. "About Mom, about the way she talked about you and Piper, about my role in not protecting you both." It was the first time David had ever acknowledged that protection might have been needed. "I can't undo what happened," he said, "but I want you to know that I understand now. What Mom did was wrong. What I allowed to happen was wrong. I felt tears building, not from sadness, but from relief. For 7 years, I'd questioned my own perceptions, wondered if I was overreacting or being too sensitive. Having David finally validate my experience was profound. The lawyers want to fight this, he continued, but I don't think that's right. I think we should settle. I think Mom needs consequences, and I think Piper needs protection. What are you saying? I'm saying I'll support reasonable restrictions on Mom's visitation. I'll testify about her behavior if needed, and I'll pay for Piper's counseling. That night, I called Sarah with the news. David's cooperation would significantly strengthen our case and likely lead to a much more favorable settlement. This changes everything, Sarah said. If he's willing to acknowledge his mother's problematic behavior on record, we can probably achieve most of your goals without a lengthy trial. But I knew David's decision would cost him. His family would view his testimony as the ultimate betrayal. He was choosing to protect his daughter over his mother, and that choice would have consequences that would last long after our legal case ended. The negotiation took 2 weeks. Margaret's attorneys initially pushed back hard, but David's defection from their side made their position untenable. The final agreement was more comprehensive than I'd dared hope for. Margaret would have no unsupervised contact with Piper for 2 years, after which visitation would be contingent on completing cultural sensitivity training and parenting classes. She would pay for Piper's ongoing counseling and our legal fees. Most importantly, the agreement would become part of our custody order, giving it the force of law. Margaret signed the agreement, but the look she gave me across that conference table told me this war wasn't over. The settlement should have brought peace. But it seemed to energize Margaret instead. Unable to see Piper directly, she began what I can only describe as a campaign of psychological warfare against me through social media and our shared community. It started subtly. Margaret began posting frequently on Facebook about the challenges of being a grandmother in modern times, sharing articles about parental alienation and the tragedy of children being separated from loving grandparents. She never mentioned me by name, but her friends knew exactly who she was talking about. The posts gained traction in her social circle. Comments poured in from her church friends and country club acquaintances, expressing sympathy for her situation and outrage at the vindictive mother who was using a child as a weapon. Praying for you during this difficult time, one comment read. Some people just can't handle the love of extended family. I've seen this before, another added. Bitter divorces where the children suffer because of one parent's hatred. Margaret was crafting a narrative where she was the victim and I was the villain, and it was working. The Whisper campaign expanded beyond social media. At the grocery store, I'd notice other shoppers staring and whispering. At Piper's school events, some parents would give me cold looks or turn away when I approached. Margaret's version of events was spreading through our community like wildfire. The hardest part was explaining to Piper why she couldn't see her grandmother. We'd prepared simple, age-appropriate explanations about needing a break to figure out better ways to spend time together. But Piper was smart and intuitive. Is Grandma Margaret mad at me about my hair? She asked one evening during dinner. No, baby, I said carefully. Grandma Margaret made some choices about your hair without asking me first. That wasn't okay. So we're taking a break while everyone learns better ways to respect each other. But I miss her sometimes, Piper admitted. She makes really good cookies. It broke my heart. Despite everything Margaret had done, she was still Piper's grandmother, and there had been some good moments between them. The loss was real for Piper, even if it was necessary. Dr. Kim helped us navigate these conversations in therapy. She worked with Piper on understanding boundaries and consent, using age-appropriate language and examples. Even people who love us sometimes make choices that hurt us, Dr. Kim explained during one session. When that happens, it's okay to take a break until they learn better ways to show love. 3 months after the settlement, I received a registered letter from Margaret's attorney. She was petitioning the court to modify our agreement, claiming that the restrictions were too severe and that she'd completed additional training on her own initiative. Sarah reviewed the petition with barely concealed annoyance. She's completed an online course in cultural sensitivity and family relationships, she said, reading from the document. It's a joke you can complete it in 2 hours. Margaret's petition argued that she'd learned from her mistakes and deserved a chance to rebuild her relationship with Piper. She included character references from her pastor, her volunteer coordinator at the hospital auxiliary, and several family friends. She's playing this perfectly, Sarah noted, coming across as the reformed grandmother who just wants another chance. The hearing on Margaret's petition was scheduled for December, just before the holidays. Her timing was strategic. What judge wants to keep a grandmother away from her granddaughter at Christmas? But Margaret made a crucial error in her petition. Buried in her supporting documents was a letter she'd written to the judge, supposedly demonstrating her new understanding of cultural sensitivity. "I now realize," the letter read, "that different families have different standards for grooming and presentation. While I may not personally understand the choice to leave a child's hair in its natural state, I respect that some parents prefer a more casual approach to appearance." Sarah highlighted that paragraph with evident satisfaction. "She still doesn't get it," she said. "She's still framing natural black hair as a casual approach rather than understanding it as a cultural and aesthetic choice deserving of respect." We prepared our response carefully, focusing on Margaret's continued failure to understand the cultural significance of her actions. Dr. Kim provided an updated evaluation of Piper's progress, noting that she was thriving in the stable environment created by the current restrictions. Meanwhile, the community battle continued. Margaret's supporters had organized a letter-writing campaign to the local newspaper, arguing that I was taking political correctness too far and damaging a child's relationship with her family. But other voices were joining the conversation too. A local organization for mixed-race families reached out with support. Several Black mothers in our school district contacted me to share their own experiences with similar family conflicts. The story was evolving beyond our personal situation into a broader discussion about cultural respect and children's rights. A regional newspaper ran a feature article about the case, interviewing experts on family law, child psychology, and cultural identity. "This case highlights the tension between family relationships and cultural autonomy," one expert noted. "The question isn't whether the grandmother loves the child, but whether that love includes respect for the child's full identity." A week before the hearing, I made a decision that surprised even Sarah. I agreed to let Margaret see Piper for one supervised visit, with Dr. Kim present to evaluate their interaction. "It's risky," Sarah warned. "If it goes well, it strengthens her petition. And if it goes badly," I replied, "it strengthens our position that she's not ready for unsupervised time." The visit took place in Dr. Kim's office with both Sarah and Margaret's attorney present. I watched through a one-way mirror as Margaret interacted with Piper for the first time in 6 months. Margaret was clearly on her best behavior, but old patterns emerged quickly. Within 20 minutes, she was commenting on Piper's hair, how much it had grown, how healthy it looked, how maybe they could do something special with it when they spent more time together. Piper's body language was telling. She became increasingly tense as Margaret focused on her appearance, eventually moving to sit closer to Dr. Kim. When Margaret pulled out a brush and suggested they tidy up Piper's hair, my daughter firmly but politely declined. "I like my hair the way Mommy fixed it," she said. Margaret's smile became strained. "Of course, dear. I just thought it might be nice to brush it. We don't brush my kind of hair when it's dry," Piper explained with the matter-of-fact tone of a child who'd been well educated on the topic. "It makes it fuzzy and damages it." Margaret looked genuinely confused, as if she'd never heard this before, despite years of living through our family's hair care routine. The visit ended with polite hugs and promises to see each other again soon. But I knew from watching that Margaret hadn't changed in any meaningful way. She was simply being more careful about how she expressed the same underlying beliefs. Dr. Kim's evaluation confirmed my observations. In her report to the court, she noted that while Margaret was clearly trying to be appropriate, she continued to focus disproportionately on Piper's appearance and showed limited understanding of cultural hair care practices. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. As that date approached, I felt confident that we'd demonstrated Margaret wasn't ready for increased access to Piper. But family court judges are unpredictable, and the holidays have a way of making people sentimental about family relationships. The modification hearing took place on a cold December morning. Margaret arrived dressed like she was attending church, accompanied by 3 family members who were there to show support. Her attorney had also brought the pastor from St. Andrew's Episcopal, who was prepared to testify about Margaret's character and community standing. Judge Morrison reviewed the case file before opening arguments. Margaret's attorney presented her petition as a story of redemption, a grandmother who'd made an honest mistake, learned from it, and deserved a chance to rebuild her relationship with her granddaughter. "Your Honor," he began, "my client has completed cultural sensitivity training, attended parenting classes, and demonstrated genuine remorse for her actions. She's a 70-year-old woman who grew up in a different era, but she's worked hard to educate herself about contemporary parenting practices." He called Margaret to testify first. She took the stand composed and articulate, acknowledging that she'd made errors in judgment, while maintaining that her actions had been motivated by love. "I realize now that I should have asked Tessa's permission before taking Piper to the salon," she said, looking directly at the judge. I was so excited about making her birthday special that I didn't think through the implications. When asked about her understanding of cultural hair care, Margaret recited what were clearly prepared talking points about respecting different family traditions and learning about diverse approaches to childcare. But Sarah's cross-examination revealed the superficial nature of Margaret's supposed transformation. Mrs. Williams, in your cultural sensitivity training, did you learn about the historical significance of natural hair in the Black community? Margaret hesitated. We discussed various cultural practices. Can you name any specific historical context that make altering a Black child's hair particularly problematic? I understand that different cultures have different traditions. That's not what I asked. Are you aware of the ways that Black hair has been policed and controlled throughout American history? Margaret's attorney objected, arguing that the question was outside the scope of the hearing, but Judge Morrison allowed it, clearly interested in the answer. I'm still learning about these issues, Margaret admitted. Sarah continued methodically, revealing that Margaret's cultural sensitivity training had been a brief online course that barely touched on racial issues. Her parenting classes had been generic sessions about child development that didn't address cultural competency at all. The most damaging testimony came when Sarah asked about Margaret's recent social media posts. Mrs. Williams, 3 weeks ago, you shared an article on Facebook titled, "When Political Correctness Threatens Family Relationships." Is that correct? Margaret's attorney objected again, but Sarah had screenshots of the post and Margaret's accompanying comment. Some people will turn anything into a racial issue rather than accept help from family. Did you write that comment? Mrs. Williams? I was frustrated. I miss my granddaughter. So, when you're frustrated, you characterize this case as manufactured racial controversy rather than acknowledging the legitimate concerns about your behavior. Margaret had no good answer. I testified next, providing a detailed account of Margaret's pattern of behavior over the years. I showed photos of Piper before and after the salon visit, read from my documentation of Margaret's comments about mixed-race children, and explained the ongoing impact on Piper's self-esteem. Dr. Kim's testimony was particularly powerful. She explained Piper's recovery process and her continued sensitivity around discussions of her appearance. The child has made significant progress, Dr. Kim noted, but she still shows anxiety when her hair becomes a topic of conversation. She's learned to protect herself by avoiding discussions about her appearance with certain family members. In your professional opinion, is Piper ready for unsupervised visits with Mrs. Williams? Not at this time. Mrs. Williams continues to view the child's natural hair as a problem to be managed rather than an aspect of her identity to be celebrated. Until that fundamental perspective shifts, unsupervised visits could undermine the child's continued healing. Margaret's attorney called her pastor, who testified about her good character and community involvement. But his testimony backfired when Sarah asked him about diversity in his congregation. St. Andrew's serves a predominantly white, affluent community, he admitted. We're working to become more inclusive, but it's an ongoing process. Has Mrs. Williams been involved in any of those inclusivity efforts? Not specifically, no. The hearing concluded with closing arguments. Margaret's attorney painted a picture of a well-meaning grandmother being punished too harshly for a single mistake. Sarah argued that Margaret's superficial attempts at education couldn't overcome years of ingrained bias, and that Piper needed continued protection. Judge Morrison took the matter under advisement, promising a decision within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks felt endless. I tried to focus on the holidays with Piper, but I couldn't shake my anxiety about the judge's decision. Family court judges have broad discretion, and Margaret had presented herself well on the stand. The decision came on January 3rd, delivered by mail in a crisp legal envelope. Judge Morrison had denied Margaret's petition for modification. The court finds that while the respondent has made some efforts toward education, these efforts appear superficial and have not resulted in meaningful understanding of the cultural issues at stake. The decision read, "The respondent continues to frame this matter as a simple disagreement about grooming, rather than recognizing the deeper issues of cultural respect and parental authority." The judge noted that Margaret's social media activity and testimony revealed ongoing minimization of the serious nature of her actions, and concluded that the current restrictions remain necessary to protect the child's emotional well-being. Margaret would have to wait the full 2-year period before petitioning for modification again. I called Sarah immediately after reading the decision. "We won," I said, hardly believing it. "You won," she corrected. Judge Morrison saw right through the performance. Margaret's own words convicted her. That evening, I explained the decision to Piper in simple terms. We would continue working with Dr. Kim, and maybe someday in the future, we'd try spending time with Grandma Margaret again when everyone was ready. That's okay, Mommy, Piper said, focused on her homework. I have lots of other grandparents who love my hair the way it is. She was right. My parents, David's father Robert, who had distanced himself from Margaret's behavior, and my extended family all celebrated Piper exactly as she was. But I knew this legal victory was just one battle in a longer war. Margaret wasn't going to give up, and her supporters in the community weren't going to forget this case anytime soon. The months following the judge's decision brought unexpected consequences. Margaret's defeat in court seemed to galvanize her supporters, who began framing our case as an example of cancel culture, destroying traditional family relationships. A group called Grandparents' Rights Coalition adopted Margaret as a cause celebre, featuring her story in their newsletter and using her case to advocate for stronger legal protections for grandparents facing frivolous restrictions from vindictive parents. Margaret herself became more sophisticated in her public messaging. Instead of the raw social media posts that had damaged her in court, she began giving carefully crafted interviews to sympathetic outlets, portraying herself as a victim of racial politics who was being punished for loving her granddaughter too much. I grew up in a different time, she told a conservative radio host. I made an innocent mistake, and now I'm branded as a racist. It's devastating to think that political correctness has reached the point where a grandmother can't take her granddaughter for a special day at the salon. The interview was shared widely on social media, generating hundreds of supportive comments and renewed criticism of me. Anonymous messages started appearing on my social media accounts, calling me everything from ungrateful to much worse. I had to make my accounts private and screen my calls more carefully. But there were also unexpected allies. A group of Black mothers in our school district reached out to form a support network. We started meeting monthly, sharing experiences and strategies for protecting our children's cultural identity in predominantly white environments. Your case gave us permission to speak up, one mother told me. I've been dealing with my mother-in-law's comments about my daughter's hair for years, but I never thought I could actually do anything about it. The group grew to include mothers of various backgrounds who'd faced similar family conflicts around their children's appearance or cultural identity. We called ourselves Protective Parents, and began offering practical support and legal referrals to families facing similar situations. 6 months after the court decision, something unexpected happened. David called to tell me that his father Robert wanted to see Piper. Dad's been really troubled by Mom's behavior, David explained. He wants to maintain a relationship with his granddaughter, but he doesn't want to go against the court order. Robert Williams had always been the quieter parent, overshadowed by Margaret's stronger personality. But apparently, the legal proceedings had forced him to confront his wife's behavior in ways he'd previously avoided. He's willing to see Piper without Mom present, David continued, and he wants to make sure you're comfortable with the arrangement. I agreed to meet with Robert at a neutral location, the same family counseling office where we'd had Margaret's supervised visit. Dr. Kim was present to observe the interaction and provide guidance. Robert looked older and more tired than I remembered. The stress of the past year had clearly taken a toll on him. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. I knew Margaret was being inappropriate with her comments about Piper, but I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I was wrong. He turned to Piper, who was sitting quietly beside me. And I owe you an apology too, sweetheart. Grandma Margaret shouldn't have changed your beautiful hair without asking your mommy first. Piper studied her grandfather carefully. Are you going to try to change my hair too, Grandpa Robert? Never, he said firmly. I think your hair is perfect exactly the way your mommy fixes it. The visit went well. Robert was genuinely interested in Piper's school activities, her friends, her favorite books. He asked thoughtful questions about her interests and listened carefully to her answers. Most importantly, he didn't mention her appearance once during the 2-hour visit. Dr. Kim recommended that Robert begin regular supervised visits with Piper, separate from Margaret. It was an arrangement that worked for everyone. Piper could maintain a relationship with her grandfather without exposure to Margaret's problematic behavior. As Piper's 8th birthday approached, I decided to do something I'd been considering for months. I wanted to document our journey in a way that might help other families facing similar situations. With Dr. Kim's guidance, I began writing a blog about our experience. I called it Protecting Our Children and focused on practical advice for parents dealing with family members who undermine their children's cultural identity. The first post, titled, When Family Love Becomes Harmful, generated an immediate response. Comments poured in from parents sharing their own stories of similar conflicts. Many thanked me for giving them language to describe experiences they'd struggled to articulate. I always felt guilty for setting boundaries with my mother-in-law, one comment read. Your story helped me understand that protecting my daughter's self-esteem isn't mean it's necessary. The blog grew quickly. I wrote about specific strategies for handling inappropriate comments, tips for building children's resilience against family criticism, and resources for parents seeking legal protection for their children's cultural rights. A publisher reached out after 6 months, interested in turning the blog into a book. The advance wasn't huge, but it would help cover Piper's ongoing counseling costs and provide financial security for our future. Piper, now thriving in 2nd grade, had grown into a confident, articulate child who could speak clearly about her own needs and boundaries. Her hair had grown back beautifully, and she wore it proudly in various natural styles. "Mommy," she said one evening as I was writing a blog post, "I want to make a video for kids like me, to tell them their hair is beautiful and nobody gets to change it without permission." The idea was brilliant. With Dr. Kim's guidance, we created a short video featuring Piper talking directly to other children about loving themselves exactly as they are. "Hi, my name is Piper, and I want to tell you something important," she said, looking directly into the camera with the confidence I'd worked so hard to build in her. "Your hair is beautiful exactly the way it grows out of your head. If someone tells you it needs to be different, you can tell them that you love yourself just the way you are." The video went viral within a week of posting. Messages poured in from parents and children around the world, thanking Piper for her message of self-acceptance and cultural pride. But the video also attracted negative attention. Margaret's supporters shared it widely, using it as evidence that I was exploiting my child for attention and brainwashing her with racial politics. "This poor child is being used as a political prop," one comment read. "She's too young to understand the damage her mother is doing to her family relationships." The criticism stung, but the positive response far outweighed the negative. Child psychologists praised the video's message of self-acceptance. Civil rights organizations shared it as an example of teaching children to advocate for themselves. Most importantly, Piper was proud of her message and the response it generated. "Look, Mommy," she said, showing me a drawing a child had sent in the mail. "This girl drew a picture of her curly hair because my video made her feel beautiful." As we approached the 1-year anniversary of our court victory, I realized our story had become something much bigger than a family legal dispute. It had become a catalyst for conversations about cultural respect, children's rights, and the ways that family love could sometimes cause harm. But our personal journey was far from over. Margaret was biding her time, building support, and undoubtedly planning her next move. 2 years after the court order, Margaret filed her petition for modification of the visitation restrictions. This time, she came prepared with a more comprehensive case. She had completed legitimate cultural sensitivity training at a local university, attended months of family counseling sessions, and compiled character references from Black community leaders who testified to her efforts at education and personal growth. Her petition included a personal letter to me, acknowledging the pain she had caused and expressing genuine remorse for her actions. "I realize now that my behavior was rooted in ignorance and unconscious bias," she wrote. "I failed to see the beauty in Piper's natural hair because I had never taken the time to educate myself about the cultural significance of Black hair traditions. I failed to respect your authority as her mother because I believed my own preferences were more important than your parenting choices." The letter continued with specific examples of what she had learned through her counseling and education. She could now articulate the historical context of hair discrimination against Black Americans. She understood how her actions had communicated rejection of Piper's racial identity. She acknowledged the harm she had caused to both Piper and me. Sarah reviewed the petition with cautious optimism. "This is significantly more substantial than her previous attempt," she acknowledged. "She's either done the real work, or she's gotten much better at faking it." The hearing was scheduled for March, just before Piper's 10th birthday. This time, the stakes felt different. Piper was older, more articulate about her own needs, and had spent 2 years building resilience and self-confidence through therapy and our supportive community. Dr. Kim's evaluation noted Piper's remarkable progress. She was thriving academically and socially, had developed strong friendships, and demonstrated healthy self-esteem and cultural pride. Most importantly, she had learned to advocate for herself in age-appropriate ways. "I think I could see Grandma Margaret again," Piper told Dr. Kim during their session. "But I want to make sure she understands that my hair is beautiful the way it is." The hearing itself was more subdued than the previous proceedings. Margaret's testimony was markedly different from 2 years earlier. She spoke specifically about what she had learned, acknowledged the cultural significance of her actions, and expressed genuine understanding of why restrictions had been necessary. When asked about her previous social media activity, she acknowledged that she had minimized the situation and failed to take responsibility for her actions. "I was embarrassed and defensive," she admitted. I knew I had made serious mistakes, but instead of doing the hard work of learning and growing, I tried to make myself the victim. That was wrong. Her cultural sensitivity trainer testified about Margaret's progress in their program. Unlike the cursory online course she had completed previously, this was a semester-long university program that included extensive reading, discussion groups with diverse participants, and practical exercises in cultural competency. Mrs. Williams was initially resistant to some of the concepts, the instructor noted, but over the course of the program, she demonstrated genuine engagement with the material and meaningful personal reflection about her own biases. I testified about Piper's progress and our current situation. The blog had grown into a book that would be published later that year. The video had inspired a nonprofit organization focused on protecting children's cultural rights. Our story had become a resource for families facing similar challenges. I'm not opposed to Piper having a relationship with her grandmother, I told the judge. But any relationship needs to be built on respect for Piper's full identity and my authority as her mother. Dr. Kim recommended a gradual reintroduction supervised visits initially, with the possibility of unsupervised time if those interactions went well. Judge Morrison approved a modified plan. Margaret could begin supervised visits immediately, with the supervision gradually decreasing over 6 months if the interactions remained appropriate. The first visit took place 2 weeks later. I watched through the one-way mirror as Margaret interacted with Piper for the first time in nearly 3 years. The change in Margaret's behavior was striking. She focused on Piper's interests, her favorite books, her art projects, her friends at school. When Piper mentioned trying a new hairstyle, Margaret responded positively. "That sounds beautiful, sweetheart. I'd love to see pictures when your mommy does it." No suggestions for improvement. No comments about manageability. No attempts to touch or rearrange Piper's hair. The visits continued successfully. Margaret followed Dr. Kim's guidelines carefully, respected my parenting decisions, and built genuine connection with Piper around shared interests rather than focusing on appearance. 6 months later, Judge Morrison approved unsupervised visits. Margaret could now spend afternoons with Piper without professional supervision, though our custody agreement maintained strict guidelines about major decisions requiring my consent. The first unsupervised visit was at a children's museum. Piper came home excited about the exhibits they'd seen and the ice cream they'd shared afterward. "Grandma Margaret said my hair looked really pretty today," she reported. And when a lady at the museum said something about it being hard to brush, Grandma Margaret told her that my mommy taught me how to take care of it and that natural hair is beautiful. That moment, hearing that Margaret had defended Piper's hair to a stranger, felt like the real victory. Our story had come full circle. The traumatized 7-year-old who had cried in my arms with chemically straightened hair had grown into a confident 10-year-old who could advocate for herself. The grandmother who had violated her granddaughter's cultural identity had done the hard work of education and growth to earn back the privilege of relationship. The book was published that fall to positive reviews and strong sales. Protecting Our Children, A Mother's Guide to Cultural Advocacy, became a resource for families navigating similar challenges. Piper contributed her own chapter to the book, writing about her experience and offering advice to other children facing family members who don't understand their cultural identity. "Sometimes people who love us make mistakes," she wrote. "It's okay to be sad about those mistakes, but it's also okay to forgive people who do the work to learn and change." If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up for what's right. And remember, you are beautiful exactly as you are, and no one has the right to tell you otherwise. The final chapter of our story wasn't about perfect reconciliation or erasure of past harm. It was about the possibility of growth, the power of education, and the importance of protecting children while leaving room for healing. Margaret would never be the grandmother I had initially hoped for, but she had become someone who could respect Piper's identity and support her growth. That was enough. And Piper, confident, articulate, proud of her heritage, had learned that she deserved to be loved exactly as she was, and that she had the power to demand that respect from everyone in her life. Our journey had taught us that love without respect isn't really love at all. But when someone is willing to do the hard work of learning and changing, real relationship becomes possible again. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to accept less than we deserve, while leaving the door open for others to rise to meet us.